Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The fluorescent lights of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center cast a sterile glow across the polished floors as Manny Pacquiao walked through the automatic sliding doors. His footsteps echoed softly in the quiet lobby, each step carrying the weight of memories that stretched back over 2 decades. In his right hand, he clutched a small manila envelope containing something precious, something that had taken him 3 sleepless nights to write. Earlier that morning, Jinky had found him sitting at their kitchen table, staring at his phone with an expression she had rarely seen. The news had reached him through a cascade of worried text messages from the boxing community. Freddie Roach, the legendary trainer who had guided him through some of the most defining moments of his career, was in the hospital. Parkinson's disease, which had been Freddie's silent companion for years, had suddenly taken a more aggressive turn. The irony wasn't lost on Manny. Here was a man who had spent decades teaching fighters how to protect themselves, how to slip punches and avoid damage. Yet he couldn't dodge the relentless advance of a disease that attacked from within. Freddie had never complained, never used his condition as an excuse, continuing to work with the same intensity that had made him one of the most respected trainers in boxing history. As Manny approached the information desk, his mind wandered to their first meeting at the Wildcard boxing club. He had been young, hungry, and relatively unknown outside the Philippines. Freddie had looked at him with those sharp, analytical eyes and seen something that others had missed. Not just talent, but the rare combination of speed, power, and heart that could translate into something extraordinary. The elevator ride to the 7th floor felt endless. Manny's reflection stared back at him from the polished steel doors, a face that had aged gracefully, but carried the subtle marks of a warrior's journey. His hands, once weapons that had dismantled some of the greatest fighters of his generation, now trembled slightly with an emotion he couldn't quite name. Was it fear? Gratitude? The overwhelming weight of unfinished conversations? He thought about Keith Thurman, who had agreed to join him for this visit. Their relationship had evolved from fierce competitors to mutual respecters of the craft. Thurman understood the significance of Freddie Roach in boxing history, but more importantly, he understood what this visit meant to Manny personally. Some moments transcended rivalry, reaching into the deeper territories of human connection and shared respect. The hospital corridor stretched before him like a timeline of his career. Each door they passed seemed to represent a different chapter: victories, defeats, comebacks, and the countless hours of preparation that had shaped not just his boxing legacy, but his character as a man. Freddie had been there for most of it, standing in his corner, shouting instructions that cut through the noise of screaming crowds. Room 712 appeared ahead, and Manny paused outside the door. Through the small window, he could see Freddie's silhouette against the afternoon light, filtering through the room's single window. The man who had once moved with the fluid precision of a master craftsman now appeared smaller, more fragile, yet somehow still radiating the quiet dignity that had always defined him. Manny's fingers found the envelope in his pocket once more. Inside were words he had never been able to say during all their years together. Words about gratitude, respect, and the profound impact one person could have on another's life. The letter contained stories Freddie had never heard, moments of doubt when his voice had provided clarity, and a confession about how their partnership had shaped not just a fighter, but a father, husband, and man. The door stood before him now, a threshold between the past and whatever came next. The door handle felt cold against Manny's palm as he slowly turned it, the soft click seeming amplified in the hospital's hushed atmosphere. As he stepped into room 712, the familiar scent of antiseptic mixed with something else, the subtle fragrance of the countless flower arrangements that lined the windowsill, gifts from fighters, promoters, and boxing enthusiasts from around the world who had heard about Freddie's condition. Freddie Roach lay propped up against several pillows, his weathered face turned toward the window, where the Los Angeles skyline stretched endlessly into the distance. The afternoon sun painted golden streaks across his features, highlighting the lines that told stories of decades spent in smoky gyms, studying tape, and perfecting the science of boxing. His hands, which had once moved with lightning precision while demonstrating combinations, now rested motionless on the crisp white hospital sheet. Manny had seen Freddie in many states over the years, exhausted after grueling training sessions, elated after victories, frustrated during difficult camps, but never like this. There was a stillness about him that spoke of battles being fought on a different kind of battleground, one where footwork and defensive positioning meant nothing against an opponent that attacked from within. The sound of Manny's footsteps caused Freddie to turn his head slowly. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something that might have been surprise, gratitude, or perhaps just the simple pleasure of seeing a familiar face in an unfamiliar place. His attempt to sit up straighter was subtle but noticeable, the automatic response of a man who had spent his life maintaining dignity, even in the most challenging circumstances. 20 minutes later, Keith Thurman appeared in the doorway, carrying a small potted orchid and wearing an expression of respectful solemnity. The former welterweight champion had changed out of his usual casual attire into a simple button-down shirt and dark slacks, understanding instinctively that this moment called for a certain reverence. His presence added a different dimension to the room, representing not just the current generation of fighters, but the continuity of boxing's lineage and the respect that transcended competitive rivalries. Thurman's eyes met Manny's briefly, and in that exchange was an understanding that went beyond words. Both men had felt the sting of Freddie's critiques, had benefited from his wisdom, and had witnessed firsthand the passion he brought to the sport they all loved. The sight of their legendary trainer in this vulnerable state affected them both, though they processed it differently. Manny with the quiet intensity of someone revisiting decades of shared history, Thurman with the sobering realization of mortality that comes to all athletes eventually. A nurse named Rosa entered quietly to check Freddie's vitals, her movements efficient yet gentle. She had been working this floor for 8 years and had seen many visitors come to pay respects to patients, but something about these two men struck her as different. There was a reverence in their presence, a weight to their visit that spoke of relationships forged through more than casual acquaintance. The room fell into a comfortable silence as the three men simply existed in each other's company. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace, traffic flowing along Melrose Avenue, people rushing to appointments, life proceeding with its usual urgency. But inside room 712, time seemed suspended, creating a pocket of stillness where reflection and memory could flourish. Manny's hand found the envelope in his pocket once again. The letter inside represented hours of careful thought, of choosing words that could adequately express a gratitude too deep for casual conversation. He had written and rewritten certain passages, trying to capture the essence of what Freddie had meant to his career, his growth as a fighter, and his development as a man who carried the hopes of an entire nation into every ring. The weight of unspoken words hung in the air like incense, sacred and patient. The afternoon light shifted gradually across the hospital room as clouds drifted past the window, creating a gentle dance of shadows and illumination that seemed to mirror the ebb and flow of memories flooding through Manny's mind. He found himself studying Freddie's hands, those same hands that had demonstrated countless combinations, adjusted his stance during training sessions, and wrapped his fists before some of the most important fights of his career. Manny remembered the first time he had truly understood Freddie's genius. It was during preparation for the Oscar de la Hoya fight, and they had been working on a specific counterpunch sequence for weeks. Freddie had noticed something in the way Manny shifted his weight, a subtle telegraph that could be exploited by an observant opponent. Rather than simply pointing out the flaw, Freddie had spent hours breaking down the mechanics, explaining not just what needed to change, but why. That attention to detail, that ability to see both the forest and the individual trees, had been the foundation of their success together. Keith Thurman positioned himself near the window, his presence respectful but observant. Having fought Manny in 2019, he had experienced firsthand the refined technique that bore Freddie's fingerprints. Even in their battle, when Keith was throwing everything he had at the Filipino legend, he could recognize the defensive patterns, the counter-punching timing, and the ring intelligence that had been cultivated through years of Freddie's guidance. Now seeing the trainer in this diminished state, Keith felt a profound appreciation for the fragility of the relationships that shape athletic careers. A physical therapist named Carlos quietly entered the room, carrying a clipboard and moving with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to working around emotional family visits. He performed his routine checks while the two fighters maintained their vigil, his presence a reminder of the daily battles Freddie now faced, small victories measured in improved mobility, clearer speech, or simply maintaining the strength to sit upright for extended periods. Manny's thoughts drifted to the Philippines, to the countless times he had called Freddie from General Santos City to discuss training plans, upcoming opponents, or simply to seek advice during difficult periods in his career. Those conversations had been lifelines during moments when the pressure of carrying a nation's expectations felt overwhelming. Freddie had never minimized those pressures or offered empty reassurances. Instead, he had provided practical strategies, breaking down complex emotional and psychological challenges the same way he analyzed an opponent's fighting style. The sound of Freddie's labored breathing created a rhythmic backdrop to the room's quiet atmosphere. Each breath represented a small act of defiance against the disease that sought to steal his vitality. Manny found something inspiring in that struggle. It reminded him of the countless fighters he had seen dig deep in the late rounds of difficult fights, finding reserves of strength they hadn't known existed. A maintenance worker named Teodoro entered briefly to check the room's heating system, his movements careful and silent, out of respect for what was clearly an important visit. He had worked at Cedars-Sinai for 15 years and had developed an intuitive sense for the emotional weight of different situations. Something about the way these two men held themselves, the careful attention they paid to the patient, told him this was more than a casual visit. The manila envelope in Manny's pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Inside were words he had crafted during late-night sessions at his kitchen table, phrases that attempted to capture decades of gratitude, respect, and affection. He had written about specific moments that Freddie might not even remember, small gestures of encouragement during difficult training camps, pieces of tactical advice that had proven crucial in major fights, and the quiet confidence Freddie had projected during the most pressure-filled moments of his career. The letter also contained something more personal, reflections on how Freddie's influence had extended beyond boxing, shaping Manny's approach to leadership, mentorship, and the responsibility that came with success. As the afternoon wore on, Freddie's awareness seemed to sharpen, his eyes focusing with greater clarity on his unexpected visitors. The medication that helped manage his symptoms created windows of lucidity that came and went like tide pools, and this appeared to be one of those precious moments when the fog lifted enough for genuine connection. His gaze moved deliberately between Manny and Keith, taking in their presence with what appeared to be a mixture of surprise and deep appreciation. Manny noticed the change immediately, the subtle straightening of Freddie's posture, the way his breathing became more controlled, the increased alertness in his expression. It was as if seeing these two fighters, representatives of different eras but united in their respect for the sport, had awakened something within him that transcended the physical limitations imposed by his condition. The trainer in Freddie was responding to the presence of his pupils, even in this sterile hospital environment. Keith moved closer to the bed, his earlier hesitation replaced by a quiet confidence. He had come here partly out of respect for boxing tradition, but also because he understood the importance of honoring the people who had shaped the sport they all loved. His own career had been influenced by trainers who had learned from Freddie, creating a lineage of knowledge that connected them all. Standing in this room, he felt the weight of that connection and the responsibility to carry forward the lessons that men like Freddie had dedicated their lives to teaching. A nurse's aide named Esperanza entered quietly to refresh the water pitcher and adjust the blinds, her movements creating barely a whisper of sound. She had been observing the visits to this room over the past week and had noticed something different about today's guests. Where other visitors brought flowers and spoke in hushed, sorrowful tones, these men brought something else, a sense of celebration, of honor being paid to someone who had earned it through decades of dedicated service. Manny's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where beneath his shirt hung a small medallion that Jinky had given him years ago. It bore the image of Santo Niño, a reminder of faith and protection that had accompanied him through countless battles. Today, he found himself offering a silent prayer, not for victory in a ring, but for the right words to express what Freddie had meant to his life and career. The letter in his pocket represented more than just gratitude. It was an attempt to create a permanent record of a relationship that had transcended the typical athlete-trainer dynamic. Freddie had been present during some of the most defining moments of Manny's career, but he had also been there during quieter times, offering advice about family, sharing stories about other fighters he had worked with, providing perspective during the inevitable challenges that came with sustained success at the highest levels of professional sports. Keith found himself remembering their own fight, specifically the moments between rounds when he could see Manny in his corner, receiving instruction from his team. Even then, in the heat of competition, Keith had recognized the calm professionalism that characterized Manny's approach to the sport. That composure, that ability to process information and adjust strategy under extreme pressure, bore the unmistakable influence of Freddie's methodical training philosophy. The afternoon sun continued its slow journey across the sky, creating shifting patterns of light that transformed the hospital room into something approaching sacred space. In this environment where healing and hope intersected with uncertainty and vulnerability, the presence of these three men created a unique tableau, a moment where the past, present, and future of boxing converged in quiet tribute to the relationships that define athletic greatness. Manny felt the envelope's edges between his fingers, knowing that the time for reading it was approaching, sensing that this window of clarity in Freddie's condition might be the perfect opportunity to share words that had been waiting years to be spoken. The decision crystallized in Manny's mind like morning dew forming on grass, sudden, natural, and inevitable. Freddie's increased alertness, the way his eyes tracked movement with renewed focus, the subtle nod he had given when their gazes met, all of it signaled that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The letter that had lived in his pocket for 3 days, that had been written and rewritten during sleepless nights in his home office, was ready to find its voice. Manny's fingers traced the envelope's edge one final time before slowly withdrawing it from his jacket pocket. The manila paper looked modest, almost insignificant, yet it contained what might be the most important words he had ever written. Freddie's eyes immediately focused on the envelope, and something shifted in his expression, a flicker of curiosity mixed with the kind of attention he had once reserved for studying fight footage of upcoming opponents. Keith noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. The casual visit was transforming into something more ceremonial, more profound. He found himself holding his breath, sensing that he was about to witness something deeply personal, yet universally meaningful. In boxing, there were public moments of triumph and private moments of connection, and this clearly belonged to the latter category. He moved slightly closer to the window, giving the two men space while remaining present as a respectful witness. The envelope made the softest whisper as Manny carefully opened it, his movements deliberate and reverent. Inside were 3 handwritten pages, covered in his careful script, words that had been chosen with the same precision he had once applied to studying an opponent's defensive patterns. Each sentence had been crafted to carry maximum emotional weight while maintaining the authenticity that characterized his relationship with Freddie. Freddie's breathing seemed to steady as he watched Manny unfold the pages. There was recognition in his expression, not just of Manny as a former fighter, but of something deeper. Perhaps he sensed the gravity of what was about to unfold, or maybe he simply understood that this visit was different from the casual well-wishes he had received from other members of the boxing community. A janitor named Bonifacio passed quietly in the hallway outside, his cartwheels creating a gentle rhythm that seemed to underscore the solemnity of the moment. He had worked these floors long enough to recognize when something significant was happening behind the closed doors, and he instinctively slowed his pace, offering these visitors the privacy their moment deserved. Manny held the pages steady, despite the slight tremor in his hands, not from nervousness, but from the overwhelming weight of gratitude that threatened to spill over into tears. The letter began with a simple acknowledgement of their first meeting at the Wildcard boxing club, but it quickly evolved into something more profound, a detailed accounting of how Freddie's influence had shaped not just a fighter, but a husband, father, and leader. The second page contained specific memories, moments when Freddie's wisdom had proven crucial, not just in boxing strategy but in life decisions. There were references to conversations Freddie might not even remember, small gestures that had meant more than he could have known, and instances when his calm presence had provided stability during chaotic periods of Manny's career. Keith found himself thinking about his own trainers, the men who had shaped his understanding of boxing and helped him reach championship level. Watching this intimate exchange between Manny and Freddie reminded him of the profound debt all fighters owe to the people who dedicate their lives to developing others' potential. It was a reminder that behind every great athlete stands a network of teachers, mentors, and guides who rarely receive public recognition for their contributions. The third page, Manny knew, contained the most personal reflections, words about legacy, about the way Freddie's teachings had been passed down to younger fighters in the Philippines, and about the permanent place he held in the Pacquiao family's heart. Manny's voice emerged soft and steady as he began reading from the first page, each word carefully enunciated with the same precision he had once brought to executing combinations in the ring. The letter opened with a simple but profound acknowledgement. 22 years of partnership that had transformed an unknown fighter from General Santos City into a global icon, but more importantly, had shaped a young man into someone capable of carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire nation. As the words filled the quiet hospital room, Freddie's eyes remained fixed on Manny's face with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the fog of his condition. There was something almost miraculous about his focus, as if the familiar cadence of Manny's voice was calling back parts of himself that the disease had temporarily claimed. His hands, which had been resting motionless on the white sheets, began to show subtle signs of movement, fingers flexing slightly in response to memories being awakened. Keith found himself deeply moved by the intimacy of what he was witnessing. The letter contained detailed recollections of specific training sessions, moments when Freddie's tactical insights had proven decisive in major fights, and countless small acts of mentorship that had occurred away from cameras and crowds. Manny described how Freddie's teaching philosophy had influenced his approach to everything from family relationships to business decisions, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond the boxing ring. A respiratory therapist named Gregorio entered quietly to check the equipment, but upon sensing the emotional weight of the moment, he delayed his routine and instead stood respectfully near the door. In his 15 years of hospital work, he had witnessed many profound exchanges between patients and visitors, but something about this particular scene, the careful reverence in the reader's voice, the intense attention of the patient, the respectful silence of the other visitor, told him he was observing something extraordinary. The second page of the letter delved into more personal territory, describing how Freddie's influence had shaped Manny's understanding of leadership and responsibility. Manny read about specific conversations they had shared during training camps, moments when Freddie had helped him navigate the complex pressures of representing not just himself, but his family, his community, and his country. The letter described how those lessons had informed his later roles as a politician, businessman, and philanthropist. Freddie's breathing became more rhythmic as the reading continued, and for moments at a time, the symptoms of his Parkinson's seemed to recede, allowing glimpses of the sharp, focused trainer who had guided some of boxing's greatest careers. His eyes never left Manny's face, and occasionally the hint of a smile would cross his features as particularly meaningful memories were recounted. The most powerful section described how Freddie's teachings had been passed down to younger fighters in the Philippines. Manny read about training sessions he had conducted in General Santos City, where he had found himself unconsciously repeating Freddie's exact words, using the same metaphors and analogies that had once been used to teach him. The letter described this as one of the highest honors he could pay to his trainer, ensuring that Freddie's wisdom would live on in future generations of fighters. Keith felt tears forming in his eyes as he listened to descriptions of how Freddie's patient guidance had helped Manny overcome not just technical challenges, but moments of doubt and uncertainty that every fighter faces. The letter painted a picture of mentorship that went far beyond sport, describing a relationship built on mutual respect, shared sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. A housekeeping supervisor named Celestina passed slowly in the hallway, instinctively recognizing that something significant was occurring in room 7112. The emotional resonance was so powerful, it seemed to extend beyond the physical boundaries of the room, creating an atmosphere of reverence that touched everyone who came near. As Manny turned to the final page, his voice carried an even deeper emotional weight, preparing to share the most personal reflections of all. The final page of the letter contained words that Manny had struggled to write, sentences that had required multiple attempts before he could capture the depth of emotion he felt. As his voice began to carry these most personal reflections, the atmosphere in the room shifted to something approaching sacred. He read about sleepless nights when the pressure of upcoming fights had felt overwhelming, and how Freddie's calm voice on the phone from Los Angeles had provided the reassurance needed to move forward. Freddie's response was immediate and profound. Tears began forming in his eyes as Manny described specific moments of vulnerability, times when the fighter had called his trainer not for technical advice, but simply to hear a familiar voice that represented stability and wisdom. The letter revealed how many of Manny's greatest victories had been as much mental and emotional triumphs as physical ones, achieved through the confidence that Freddie's presence had instilled. Keith watched as Freddie's entire demeanor transformed. The frailty that had seemed to define him moments earlier gave way to something more fundamental, the essence of a man whose life's work had touched others in ways he was only now fully understanding. A single tear escaped down Freddie's weathered cheek, followed by another, as the true impact of his mentorship was laid bare through Manny's carefully chosen words. The letter's most powerful passage described how Freddie had become not just a trainer, but a father figure whose influence had shaped Manny's approach to raising his own children. Manny read about conversations with Jimuel, Michael, Princess, Queen Elizabeth, and Israel, where he had found himself sharing lessons learned in Freddie's gym. Not about boxing techniques, but about perseverance, respect, and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who believe in your potential. A floor nurse named Remedios paused outside the room, drawn by an emotional resonance that seemed to emanate from within. Through the partially open door, she could see the three men locked in a moment of profound connection, and she instinctively understood that she was witnessing something that transcended ordinary hospital visits. She remained still, offering silent witness to what was clearly a sacred exchange. Keith felt his own eyes filling with tears as Manny read about how Freddie's influence had extended to his humanitarian work in the Philippines. The letter described schools and medical clinics that had been built with money earned in fights where Freddie's strategic guidance had proven crucial. In this way, Freddie's impact had reached thousands of people who would never know his name, but whose lives had been improved through the success his mentorship had made possible. The most emotionally charged section revealed Manny's deepest fear, that he had never adequately expressed his gratitude while they were both healthy and working together. The letter served as an attempt to bridge that gap, to ensure that Freddie understood the profound and lasting impact he had made on not just a career, but an entire family's trajectory. Freddie's tears flowed more freely now, not from sadness, but from an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. The tremor in his hands seemed to quiet as emotion took precedence over physical symptoms. His eyes remained locked on Manny's face, with a clarity and intensity that reminded Keith of the focused trainer he had heard about for years. As Manny reached the letter's final sentences, words of eternal gratitude and a promise that Freddie's teachings would continue to influence future generations, the emotional weight in the room became almost tangible. Keith found tears streaming down his own face, moved not just by the content of the letter, but by witnessing the raw honesty of two men acknowledging the profound bond that had shaped both their lives. The silence that followed was filled with the sound of quiet crying from all three men, each processing the magnitude of what had just been shared. The minutes that followed existed in a suspended state of grace, where the normal rhythms of hospital life seemed to pause in deference to what had just transpired. Freddie's tears had transformed his entire appearance. The man who had entered this room as a patient battling a degenerative disease now radiated the dignity and strength that had defined his legendary career. The letter had awakened something profound within him, a reminder of the lasting legacy he had created through decades of patient teaching and mentorship. Manny carefully folded the letter and placed it on the bedside table where Freddie could see it, a tangible reminder of words that had taken years to formulate, but only minutes to share. The weight that had resided in his chest for so long, the accumulated gratitude, respect, and love that had never found adequate expression, had finally been released. His shoulders seemed lighter, his breathing deeper, as if he had completed a task that was essential to his own spiritual well-being. Keith remained near the window, still processing the emotional intensity of what he had witnessed. As a professional athlete, he understood the relationships that could develop between fighters and their trainers, but seeing this level of profound connection had given him new insight into the deeper purposes that sport could serve. The bond between Manny and Freddie transcended boxing, representing something universal about mentorship, gratitude, and the ways that one person's dedication could reshape another's entire life trajectory. A shift supervisor named Salvacion appeared briefly in the doorway, drawn by reports from her staff about the unusual atmosphere surrounding room 712. What she observed was immediately recognizable to someone who had worked in healthcare for over 20 years, the aftermath of a profound emotional breakthrough, a moment when healing occurred on levels that had nothing to do with medicine or technology. She withdrew quietly, instructing her team to give the visitors additional privacy. Freddie's condition seemed remarkably improved in the wake of Manny's reading. His posture was straighter, his breathing more controlled, and most notably, his tremor had significantly diminished. Medical professionals might attribute this to the emotional stimulation or temporary adrenaline response, but to those present in the room, it felt like something more profound, as if being reminded of his life's true impact had restored part of his essential vitality. The afternoon sun had shifted to its golden hour position, casting warm light that transformed the sterile hospital room into something approaching a chapel. The three men sat in comfortable silence, each processing the experience in his own way. For Manny, there was a sense of completion, of having honored a debt that could never be fully repaid, but had finally been acknowledged. For Keith, there was newfound appreciation for the mentors in his own life, and a determination to express gratitude before it was too late. As visiting hours drew to a close, Manny rose slowly from his chair and approached Freddie's bedside one final time. Without words, he placed his hand gently on his trainer's shoulder, a gesture that conveyed everything that remained unsaid. Freddie's response was equally silent, but profound. He reached up and briefly covered Manny's hand with his own, a touch that confirmed the letter's message had been received and treasured. Keith approached as well, offering his own gesture of respect with a slight bow that acknowledged not just Freddie's legendary status, but the private moment of grace he had been privileged to witness. The three men shared a final look that required no words, an understanding that this afternoon had created a memory that would endure long after the hospital stay ended. As they prepared to leave, nurses and staff members who had observed the visit gathered quietly in the hallway, their faces reflecting the emotional impact that had rippled throughout the entire floor, proving that some moments of human connection are too powerful to be contained within four walls. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.